title of his thesis is 2 years and counting, the Qatari Gulf Crisis. His supervising professor is Dr. Elizabeth Bishop in the Department of History.
That's right. Again, I'm Jeff Sloan. I'm very much looking forward. I've been really actually looking forward to presenting this topic. It's been something I've been thinking about for now 2 years, actually. I was fortunate to go on a fellowship to Doha, Qatar, back in April of 2017. And so it kind of got the juices flowing because I was there in mid-April, and then the Qatari Gulf Crisis, which is what I'll be talking about today, actually began only 2 months after I was there. So I'm going to touch on that a little bit more once we get into it. But I think it's really important to actually talk about what I want to get out of this project, because with the methodology, that's really what has taken me the longest amount of time to kind of unwrap and get started. And so the rest of the content and the more specifics of this study have been a little bit after the fact, obviously, because I wanted to know what direction I wanted to go in. And so I talked with my advisor, Dr. Bishop, and I said, you know, this is a very contemporary issue. This is something I'm very passionate about because I've actually been on the ground and gotten to visit with members of the foreign ministry in Qatar. And so I really want this to be a big monumental, like, earth-shattering piece of work, right? And she said, well, as long as we have a solid methodology, then that's something that she thought was very important for me to get forward, because while this is very contemporary, and I'm very proud of the work that has been done so far, it's also not a very earth-shattering methodology either. It's kind of just presenting a question, running the test, and seeing what happened. And so with that, with my methodology, it's kind of divided into 3 different areas specifically. So we have the stated goals of what those who began the Gulf Crisis had. We have the more overt goals of what they might have had, and then we also have the byproducts or the after effects. And so with this, just to kind of keep with clarity, for those of you who may not be as aware with the Gulf Crisis, there were multiple countries within the Gulf, including Egypt, that actually declared that they'd be cutting diplomatic ties with Qatar in June of 2017. And so following that, there were a lot of repercussions because this impacted trade within the region, impacted the Gulf Cooperation Council, which Qatar is a member with Saudi Arabia and many other Gulf nations. And there was a list of 13 demands that were presented to the Qatari officials, government officials. And so with those, this created what I defined as a demanders and a recipient class. And so with the demanders, those were the ones who cut off diplomatic ties. Those are the ones who basically caused this diplomatic crisis. But even within the wording that specifically, it's difficult to define, simply because it's not the intention of this work to present blame or place blame or even go into the specifics of whether or not some of the demands that they have on the list were based in true fact or whether or not they were based in speculation. So just again, to kind of give you all a little bit more context about this situation, the list of demands includes curbing for Qatar to curb ties and end missions within Iran and Israel, sever ties to all terrorist organizations, which again, I'll go into how that is actually a very broad concept, shutting down Al Jazeera Media Network in its entirety, shutting down other Qatari-funded news agencies such as Arabi 21, Rasad, Al Arabi, Al Jadid, and the Middle East Eye, pardon my lacking Arabic skills. Terminate all Turkish military presence, and then if the demanders, the demander class, which I have defined, or the U.S. deems any group a terrorist organization, then it is up to Qatar to cut all ties with them and expel all those individuals as well. Additionally, we see that they are required to hand over all terrorists or individuals who are classified within that terrorist category as the demanders or the U.S. classify them. Stop granting citizenship to any Gulf expatriates, so this could be Saudi Arabian citizens who are in Qatar, to stop granting citizenship to those who wish for it. Stop all contacts with political opposition for all the demander countries, so anyone who's not within the Al Saud family in Saudi Arabia, for example. Reparations to all those affected by Qatari policies. Again, a very broad blanket statement, which really doesn't have any sort of practical way for Qatar to carry it out, or specifications as well. A realignment of the Qatari military with the demanders according to the 2014 Riyadh Summit, which hopefully I'll have time to get into here in a moment. An agreement to comply with all of these terms within 10 days of the June 22nd announcement of the demands, and then finally a monthly audit for the next 10 years for Qatar to ensure its compliance with all these demands. So this is really difficult because there's actually no primary documents for this text at the moment. All official or rather unofficial announcements of these demands has been done through news agencies, first Reuters and then the AP, and shortly thereafter, believe it or not, Al Jazeera. And so we do see that it's very difficult to work with primary documents on this project because the demands are very unofficial. And for those demands that are official through news agencies or whatever press releases are released through Qatar or any of the demander countries, it's hearsay for one, and then they also claim for it to be very non-specific. So with these demands, the Qatari officials have kind of gone back and said, well, we need to open a dialogue, we need to open a way to see how we can actually address some of the more specifics of these demands. We also need to see how this is going to be implemented, because this is a very unprecedented and objectively absurd way to go about foreign policy, especially for countries within the same region who share many trading partners, many military alliances, and also are part of the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, which is a regional intergovernmental organization. And so with that, again, it's very difficult because the Qatari officials need to understand, or need the demanders to understand, that there is more that needs to be brought to the table, because in a punitive measure, the demanders have cut diplomatic ties. But in effect, that actually makes it very difficult for the Qatari officials to have official channels of communication between their delegations and the delegations of the entire demanders. So it's kind of a catch-22. It's impossible to have any sort of more specifics on the demands. It's impossible to have any way of going about maybe the 10-year audit or any sort of way to narrow down what these demands could entail, maybe take off a few or make some of them less intense. But none of that's possible if there aren't any sort of official diplomatic channels between these countries. And again, while Saudi Arabia is the leadership within the demanders, this also includes the UAE, Egypt, Bahrain, among others as well. And while the demanders who have actually cut oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Can I borrow this real quick? Sure. While the demanders who actually have cut diplomatic ties are within the GCC and Egypt, we also see that there are others who have reduced diplomatic ties as well, whether that means declaring some of their ambassadors PNG, persona non grata, or maybe that means recalling their own delegations, or even cutting off official communiques between the two delegations. So with that, we also see, to get back to this methodology again, that while I was working with Dr. Bishop, again, this is very contemporary and there's a lot going on. It's been changing very quickly, so it's been a little bit difficult to keep up with it. We also see that it's kind of at a stalemate because there hasn't been much progression since the 10-day mark passed, and obviously nothing happened because diplomatic ties still have not been restored at this point. And that's another reason I'm so excited about this work also, because at the time that this work is completely finished, it'll be almost at the 2-year mark this June of 2019. So again, with the methodology, I think it was also important to incorporate with the third area, which, to remind y'all, was about the byproducts and the after effects. This is kind of once we've run the test to see what state interference really is and if that has occurred and why that has occurred. Once we get to this third part, which is more of the after effects, the byproducts, we see that there are many different areas, hopefully that I have time to touch on each of them. We see that the airlines have been touched because airline traffic is something that Qatari Airways can't even fly over airspace within, say, Saudi Arabia or Egypt or the other demanders. It also has changed prices and changed flight patterns because Doha is a major hub going between what we consider the global north or the west and the east or the global south. We also see that food production has been a major impact also because this is a very, very small country. It's almost completely non-arable land. And so with that, almost all of their food is reliant on imports. And when those imports are cut off from say, their only land border country, which is Saudi Arabia, then within 48 hours, there was an immediate food crisis for a country that often does not have to worry about food, simply because the average per capita income is so high, et cetera. We also see that education was something that I actually got to witness firsthand, because when I was over there, we had a visit to Qatar University, and there were actually students, grad students and PhD candidates, who were actually flying in 3 days a week from Abu Dhabi to go to class, which, I mean, to think that that's even a possibility is amazing. But to get to visit with some of these students, and at this point, I'm not sure if they're able to still attend class. I mean, technically, those citizens of that other demander country are not actually allowed to enter Qatari borders. So I'm not sure how those students are able to continue their coursework because from everything I've read online, all coursework that was not completed before the demands were presented, all those degree plans were completely cut, and there was no transferability within those courses as well, which as a student I cannot absolutely fathom. Thank you. We also see that trade has been something that's been a more recent impact of the Gulf crisis because Qatar announced in December they'd be leaving OPEC, which is a major development within the trade within the region, simply because a lot of these non-renewable resources are actually going from Qatar to the global north or the west. We see that it's the second largest LNG, liquid natural gas producer and exporter in the entire world for a country with only 300,000 citizens. With that, you can see that there are major impacts of this Gulf crisis and blockade and cutting of diplomatic ties for Qatar specifically. But it's amazing also because their GDP has actually grown since this has happened and is projected to continue to grow, simply because their economy is based on that LNG exportation. Additionally, because we are running a little bit short on time, I just want to touch on a few of the areas that I'm using for specific foci. With the demands, I wanted to focus mainly on the first, second, and sixth demand, which focus more on the international relations aspect, which include the curbing ties and ending missions in Iran and Israel, severing ties to terrorist organizations, and declaring that all those terrorist organizations and individuals are not allowed within the country. But this, again, is a slippery slope because how we define terrorist is very subjective on an individual basis or from state to state, because how the U.S. defines a terrorist or any of the demanders, according to these demands, is actually if the demands are to be carried out, those exact people for which Qatar is supposed to get rid of out of their country. And so with that, it actually impedes on the state sovereignty of Qatar because how they define a terrorist or a terrorist organization is completely within their sovereign rights, despite the fact that this, among many other demands, are areas that the demanders would rather they not touch on. We also see that my other focus with this work specifically is with demand number 3, which is the closure of Al Jazeera. It's an area I would have actually liked to delve into more as an active journalist, but we also see that it's again, an ongoing debacle simply because a lot of the news coming out of the region about this crisis is done by Al Jazeera. But in an effort to be objective about this situation, it's a little bit difficult to find some of that news or primary source documentation when almost all of it is either being provided for by or written by Al Jazeera, one of the factors in question. And so finally, the other area that I'm also focusing on quite a bit is kind of a comparison between this situation and other situations outside the region, which again harkens back to the necessity of this methodology to really be considered usable in other situations, because this is not the only time state interference has taken place or attempted state interference has taken place between countries, between interstate relations. And so we see I'm also making comparison between GCC, Gulf Cooperation Council, and Qatari relations, Iran and Saudi GCC relations, Saudi and Turkish relations, Iran, Saudi, and Israeli relations, simply because that's an interesting trifecta where two countries who often you would imagine wouldn't line up in policy actually do, because it's the enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of situation. And then finally, a small comparison to the Arab Spring, because that does actually impact how we look at my second main focus point, which is on Al Jazeera, simply because with the media aspect, you see that there was an attempt to suppress media basically within every country in the League of Arab States, and even other areas in the Middle East as well. But you can see that there are comparisons between the suppression of media within the Arab Spring in 2011-2012, and then also here since 2017 with this attempted suppression of media of Al Jazeera among other Qatari-funded outlets. And so with this, I think this is a good place to stop because there are a lot of other places that I could really just keep going on and on about. But I want to kind of stop at a good stopping point for y'all. So thank you so much.
About like 4 minutes for questions and answers.
Which is something I'm really looking forward to also, because I want to be able to incorporate y'all's thoughts as well. So yes.
Just a quick thought, but have you considered publishing any of the results in forums other than academic journals, just because it's an evolving situation. A lot of people could benefit from having a deeper understanding of what's actually going on, and the wheels of academic publishing are kind of like the wheels of justice, and you know.
Unless they publish with my journal, which has a 6-month turnaround at most.
Wow.
For example.
Do you have any ideas of where?
Well, I don't have any suggestions.
Okay.
I was just wondering if you were considering publishing, you know, before the intended project is completed.
I think that would be a good idea. I have talked to Dr. Bishop just a little bit about it, but we've been focusing more on academic publications that often take even more than 6 months, as I have realized with other works I've done with her that are still not completed. But yes, I think that's a point taken. Thank you. Appreciate it. Other comments, questions? Yes, thank you. Oh gosh. So another point I wanted to touch on a little bit more is that this isn't the first time this has happened in the GCC. Saudi has led attempts to try and edge out Qatar in the past, in 2014 with the Riyadh Summit, as I touched on for just a moment, and also in 2002. And it kind of was a stalemate, nothing really happened, and then both sides just gave up and said, okay, fine, just have your sovereignty, whatever, do what you want. But this is much more abrupt, and that's why I stated that this is really unprecedented, to tell you the truth. Because this is a very peculiar way about going as far as international relations and diplomacy go. Because this is really just a millimeter away from physical military action. So
That's what happened.
and so-
It's kind of the next Yemen.
Right. But this is, again, so unprecedented because this is not the kind of country that has this type of citizenry like Yemen or Syria does. So I wouldn't anticipate military action, but there have been opinion pieces written about how maybe this could end in regime change because the Al Thani family, which rules Qatar, had a bloodless coup as early as the 90s. So I think that's, no telling, to tell you the truth. So, yes?
Thank you for that. One thing I was just thinking about in regard to methodology, you mentioned sort of the language question. How is your Arabic? How was it dealing with those types of sources? Can you talk a little bit about?
And that's one of the, again, a fortunate thing about working with GCC countries is that almost everything is doubled in English anyway, because they know all these press releases are going to the US or to global northwestern countries. So it's been difficult finding primary sources in the first place, much less having to worry about them being only in Arabic.
Right.
So I haven't really run into that, to tell you the truth. Again, this is such a quick, evolving happening that all of the primary sources that I have come across are all very top level. It's not like individuals writing a personal memoir or anything like that. So thankfully that hasn't been an issue, but on other projects I've done, it has very much been an issue. So, thank you. Yes?
No, well, we're out of time, but I can ask you while you take your picture.
Okay.
Yay!